Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. I'm Steph McKenna.
And I'm James Gill.
From the National Centre for Writing here at Dragon Hall in Norwich, England.
We are super excited to bring you this month's podcast, How to Grip Your Readers, with the amazing Julia Crouch. Julia is a crime and noir novelist, so she really knows how to grip readers. And this episode has dozens of great tips for writers of all genres.
Julia explains how characters and their development can grip readers. She explains how we can build narrative tension and how conflict is a key driver of a reader's attention.
We also discuss the role of dead bodies, how to create and use twists, as well as lots of great technical tips on how to sow the seeds of intrigue.
Julia Crouch, the queen of domestic noir, has written 7 novels, including Cuckoo, The Long Fall, her new novel The Daughters, and Tarnished, which you guys chat about in the episode.
Julia is also the tutor for our Start Writing Crime Fiction course, which starts in January. So if you want to kickstart your crime novel, and you, like me, think Julia sounds like a brilliant tutor, why not head over to the website to explore the course modules?
Those courses are on sale now for the January 2023 term, and we've got beginners and advanced courses in genres including fiction, historical fiction, creative non-fiction, poetry, memoir, and our new screenwriting course.
In addition to our courses, we hold various in-person and online events. So if you're in the area, you might like to attend one of the following forthcoming events. The Republic of Reading Gala here at Dragon Hall, it's on November the 12th. The Women's Poets Festival, also here on November the 19th. And we also have the ever-popular City of Literature Publishing Fair coming up on December the 3rd. These are just a few of the events, so head to the website for full listings.
I have to say I'm very excited for the City of Literature Publishing Fair. We hosted one back in May as part of Norfolk and Norwich Festival, and it was a lot of fun, and it was packed full of brilliant people. So now, without further delay, here is Julia Crouch.
Welcome, Julia. Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to us today. I'm very excited to have our conversation about how to grip readers, but I think I'm keen to get just a little sort of potted history of who you are, and of course I can see your books behind you. And I've dipped to the first 100 pages of Tarnished, so I'm ready to talk about how to grip it.
The nasty discovery in Whitstable, yes.
That's it, right? But then I'm more intrigued with some of the other bits and pieces that are coming through the family. But I'm sure we'll get to that. But give us a bit of a sort of a potted history of you, Julia, and your relationship with us here at the Writing Centre.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. So I started out in theatre. My first degree was in drama, and I was a theatre director and devising writer. So that meant I wrote plays, but in a rehearsal room with actors, sort of in a Mike Lee-ish sort of style. So character-led and from improvisations and then scripting and structuring, which is kind of relevant to how I write now. But then at about the age of 32, I decided that I needed to have a job that would pay me well to stay at home, and because I had 2 children and my partner's an actor, so he's away a lot as well. So we were both going to be away a lot, not earning a great deal, which isn't ideal when you've got young children. So I retrained. Sort of got free funding back in the day, you know, when you were poor, you could get free funding to train. And I did an HND in visual communication and became a graphic designer, which I was for 10 years. I was a graphic designer and then I became a website designer because we're talking kind of 90s, beginning of the 2000s, and got it very deeply into coding and stuff like that. But something was unfulfilled. And I ended up doing an MA in sequential illustration, telling stories with pictures, because I thought I was pictures, not words. And I discovered on that course, where I was with a whole bunch of kind of, all my peers were incredibly visually literate. Most of them had done, their first degrees had been in fine art or illustration, and they'd done art foundation and everything. They come through that stream, which I certainly hadn't. And whereas they were all struggling with the words part of the course, I was kind of like dashing it off in the evening. And I wrote and illustrated 2 children's books, and I really found the writing part of that, the coming up with the words, and the story in words, by far the easiest element, The pictures, I have so much respect for illustrators because you have so many more choices. Because not only do you have story and words and all of that, you also have line, form, shape, composition, character, colours, texture, medium, whether you use a line or not, all of those sorts of things. And the decision making is mammoth, and the capacity to make massive balls ups is enormous, that then mean you have to go back and start again. So I found that incredibly hard, and then I thought, right, okay, I'm going to explore this words thing a bit more, and I did a couple of Open University writing courses, which I really, really enjoyed and learnt so much about craft, and that kind of is relevant to why we're here today, really, because I believe that there's three elements to becoming a successful writer. And by successful, I mean one that's happy with the writing that you're doing, not necessarily kind of published by a kind of big five of publisher. One is talent and kind of aptitude, which is innate, and some people have that. One is craft, and one is hard work. And I think you can get by with any two of those. And I've done a lot of teaching, and I have seen beginner writers who I thought, they're trying hard, and there's something there, and then they have worked and worked and worked, and they have listened to what they've been taught, and they've listened to their peers, and they've listened to their feedback, and they have grown as writers, and some of them have gone on to be published. So, it can happen. I think I was lucky because I have a words thing. I've always had a fascination with words, and I've loved telling stories. That's in my family. My nana would go on and on and on. She wasn't a great writer, but she was certainly a great storyteller. And Nana, you'll recognise from as she's quite close to the Gran in Tarnished, although she doesn't get up to quite everything that the Gran in Tarnished does, which we won't talk about more. So I was very encouraged by one of my tutors, John O'Donoghue, who is he's a teacher, a memoirist, and a poet based here in Brighton. He's one of my Open University teachers, and his kind of confidence in my abilities helped me take things further. I wrote a few short stories, read them out at short story nights with my knees audibly knocking, and then I did NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, which, if anyone listening hasn't heard of, it's where you literally write a novel in a month. I think they do it several months throughout the year now, but back when I was doing it, it was the month of November. Hundreds of thousands of people around the world, buckle down, write 1,700 words a day, 7 days a week for 30 days, and you end up, this is the amazing thing, you end up with 50,000 words, which is, in terms of length, The Catcher in the Rye, in terms of quality, not quite. but the thing is that you write fast and you write dirty, and I was one of those people, and I'm sure lots of people chime with this, who kind of would write the first 3 chapters, want to write a novel, have a great idea, write the first 3 chapters, run out of steam, think, oh, I started in the wrong place, go back, start again, end up again, for the second go at the first 3 chapters, same thing, go back, never get any further than that. The speed with which you have to write with NaNoWriMo stops you stalling like that. And you have to go on, and you have to go on with the knowledge that you can go back and fix it later, which is something I have carried with me through my 7 so far published novels. That, that's how you get through, that's how you climb that mountain. This is how I climb it anyway. I have bags of insecurity and self-doubt, and I go through these moments of feeling everything's hopeless and I can't do it, and whoever thought, why on earth did I ever think I could do that? And I go through that with every novel, and I know that most of my publisher friends who are published writers also have these moments, and it can hit at any point between, I'd say, about 10,000 to 40,000 words. For me, it's around 30,000 words where I go, oh my God, what is all this? But I'm so far in by that time, to quote Macbeth, to go back would be as tedious as to go, or something like that. But he's in blood so steep so far. I am in story steep so far. So I just have to forge on, and I know that I can go back. I will go back and rewrite probably quite a large chunk of the beginning.
Okay, and I mean, but you are perfectly positioned to talk about this topic of how to grip one's reader. And again, I read a bunch of the reviews from your books. I don't know if there is a more complimentary word than unputdownable, which was one that I've seen in review of your books. I then went on to purchase a copy of Tarnished, your 2013 book, and I've read the first 100 pages. And I have to say, I mean, I'm gripped, right? So for all of those reasons, I rest my case. Let's talk about how to grip one's reader. So if you're happy to, a couple of sort of broad questions about gripping the readers. We can get into some technical, some specific bits. My first question is a broad one. What is it that makes something gripping? Is it emotional? Is it action? Is it relationship to topic? What are the broad things that make something gripping?
Okay, so there's two elements, sort of in the very broadest terms. There's plot and character. And you really, really have to care about the characters. You don't have to like them, but you have to care about what happens to them. And I think that's one thing that they have to have a level of emotional investment in the characters. You have to believe the story world. So you have to kind of there should be nothing in it that chimes as odd. Do you know what I mean? There has to be that. It has to be coherent. You have to there has to be a coherent world that you will buy into. This is all about caring. You have to buy in 100% to the world that you're reading. If there are bits that make you go, hey, what's that? What does that mean? How did that happen? Then you'll step outside and you cease to be gripped. So you have to remain within the story. But there's also the story as well, and there's always kind of like arguments about what's the most important story or plot or character. And in crime fiction, lots of people say, well, plot's most important. Well, I completely disagree with that. I think that the two of them should grow together. So plot is what happens, essentially, and why happens as well. And it is due to the actions of the characters. The characters make things happen. So you have to kind of... When I'm developing my story outlines, the character and the story kind of develop hand in hand. But at some point, the characters take over and they go, I wouldn't do that. So then you have to find ways of engineering a situation so that they will do that, because you need them to do that for the story. But if you make it too kind of false and the engineering structure too obvious, then it again... the reader will step outside because they'll go, they wouldn't do that. Because by that point, they know and care about the characters as well as you do. They'll probably have a very different visual image of the character. And I don't really totally understand it. But when I'm writing, like at the minute, I'm developing a new novel. And I've just last night sent off to my agent I write about a 5,000 page story outline. What happens? And I already know my protagonist so well. And I know what she looks like. I know what she's doing almost in any given situation. So actually, kind of, I think that the writer has to get that level of intimacy with their characters in order for the book to be gripping and unputdownable. But there also have to be, in terms of crime fiction, there have to be things that the reader kind of doesn't see coming. But then when they happen, the reader goes, of course. You can't have Deus Ex Machina. You can't have something coming completely out of the blue. You have to plant seeds all along the way. And as a writer, that for me, that comes at various points in the writing process. So I won't necessarily, if Chekhov's gun appears in the fourth act, I might not have written it in the first. So I have to go back and place it there. I mean, I'm talking about a metaphorical gun. Sometimes it's a very literal gun. I learned that with my first book, Cuckoo, where the copy editor said I had a character stuck in a room and she had to get out. It was the line editor said, "There's a gun in the house, remember?" Because one of Gareth, the husband, had shot a rabbit, and I went, "Of course." So I went on and rewrote that last scene with including the gun, which kind of gave it a whole new level of danger. So planting things that the reader doesn't see as a plant, so you can't very obviously plant something, but just kind of mention it.
Sorry, I wanted to add in and ask as well, because when I started reading Tarnished, I have a book at home and I have a book at work, and then I had your book as well. And so Tarnished is it's crime fiction. I was reading a J.G. Ballard short story. The setting is that the world has stopped turning, and so that everywhere around the world is one time. And then the other book I'm reading, which I've just finished, is David Mitchell's Thousand Autumns of Jacob Zoot. Now, they're three very different books, but I was gripped in each of them by different things. So the bit I wanted to ask you mentioned plot and character, but the J.G. Ballard, the setting kind of gripped me. I like science fiction, I like fantasy. And so it's the sort of the what if the world stopped? What if you were in space? What if aliens arrived? Is that sort of part of the mix? And is that certain types of reader?
Yeah, I start every novel actually with a what if. I start off with a situation, a what if, a setting, because setting is very important to me, and I call it a smell, but it's a kind of, a kind of sense of what the kind of atmosphere I want to create. So yeah, what if is really important. But for me, that what if is more a question to kick off the ideas, the story ideas, and I don't know how much it is eclipsed by the resulting novel. Do you see what I mean? That it's kind of so buried in there. I mean, you could pare it right back, but unless I said to you, for example, with Cuckoo, what if a woman inspired the same level of passion in you? This is what got me going with that. The same level of passion in you as PJ Harvey did in Nick Cave, So He Wrote the Boatman's Call, and that woman happened to be your best friend. That's the what if. So that was the whole thing that set the idea of Cuckoo going.
And it's actually, there's a fantasy writer who said that the setting often grips readers of fantasy and science fiction, but the setting can't then propel you all the way through. So it's a sort of short term. Oh, that sounds interesting. But if to your point, the plot and the character don't follow, then it's not going to get you through the 1,200 pages of one of those sort of space operas.
Because I suppose unless you're writing a very extreme form of science fiction, the setting is essentially an inert thing, isn't it? Although I have to say, a novel that is yet to find a home, which I have great hopes for, that I've written called it was called The Childminder, but it's become The Witch House, and that's telling, is told, certain parts of the novel are told from the point of view of a house. An old house, which has, it's an old Trullo in Puglia. It has secrets in its stones, and it has memories. And I say things like, if a house could feel, this house would feel angry at what's going on, or whatever. But I'm having fun as the writer. But so yeah, not always a setting can have a little bit more dynamism to it. But I don't suppose. Well, I suppose anything can happen in fiction, can't it? I was going to say a setting can't influence a plot, but of course it can. Of course it can. Can you be truly miserable in certain settings? And if you are, then that makes the story stronger. So if you're in a beautiful place, but you've got a character who's feeling totally miserable, that's a much more interesting proposition than if she's feeling miserable in a doomy moor somewhere.
True. And just quickly on the Mitchell, I'm not really, I don't read much of that sort of type of thing, although I like David Mitchell. It was particularly just his writing. It's such beautiful writing. So that was gripped in that. But when I read Tarnished, exactly as you describe, I've got the vision, and there's no spoilers here. We won't have to go, for anyone who may pick it up, is the metal detector person on the beach in Kent. And immediately, because I'm aware of, the kind of thing that you write, I'm already excited. Because that's what you do when you do metal detecting. You're finding something, and then finds the blonde lady's head. But then I'm sort of zapped out of that first chapter, which is totally gripping. Because of course, to your point earlier, I'm asking questions. Who is she? What happened to her? Why just the head? Are we going to know, etc.? What led to it? But then beyond that, I get the protagonist, Peg, and I get her story, which is in itself also gripping. There are a couple of different things going on. I have to say the grandmother with her passing in and out of memory and so on is also like, oh my God, what are we going to find out? Can we find out? So I just felt, reading it through a lunch break and a bit more, it's sort of almost just like adrenalized coming off the end of it. So you're clearly an expert. It's interesting. Talk us through the devices at a sort of a craft level of deploying all of those elements. And that's within the first 85 pages.
Yeah. So I think I am quite a big fan of prologues. I think particularly with my kind of fiction, which I'd say that the domestic noir tends to subvert the tradition, or most psychological thrillers tend to subvert the traditional kind of crime fiction trajectory, which is the traditional one is disruption, body, murder, found, and then gradually the detective with the any other protagonists and the reader work together to put the world to rights, and you end up with an ordered world. The trajectory of sort of psychological thriller stroke domestic noir is a depiction of a fairly perfect world, which is dismantled. And so the characters are changed at the end in the same way as you have to have a character changing. That's an important part of being gripping. A novel is a character's journey, and they are different at the end to how they are at the beginning. In a psychological thriller, their world is disrupted. So they're in a worse place, usually, or they've learnt through something terrible and they've moved a step in another direction by the end. So if you're starting off with a perfect world, and I learnt this from my first agent, because everyone says, well, lots of students say to me, I understand that a prologue's a bad thing and agents don't like them. In fact, my first agent made me put a prologue into Cuckoo, my first book, because he said, the first couple of chapters read like an Argus saga. We don't know that it's going to be turned nasty. So what I've done is put a very, very short, it's a gory prologue. It's like a paragraph, and it gives a flavour and a sense of what's going to happen. So prologues are very important to give. If you're going to go dark, they're very important. I find them not important, useful to give a sense of colour the possibly lighter opening chapters of establishing the world that is about to be disrupted by whatever is discovered.
Okay. As I'm sort of watching various people and doing my own research sort of online and what have you, I've discovered the concept of the promise, and is essentially, when we talk about what's gripping and how to grip people, is that really about the promise? So the promise of the first few pages of Tarnished are that I'm going to find out what happens to this person, and that's for having the prologue is a great way of making that promise as early as possible, because always the challenges with the info dump and scene setting is less exciting, whereas you'll get through that if you've been given a promise at the beginning.
Yeah, although I would really always advise against info dumping, that it has to be framed within character and story. And also I'd kind of say that the other thing is, and possibly that's something that isn't quite so evident in my early novels, but certainly I'm very brutal with now, if something doesn't earn its place by advancing things narratively, it has to go. So even if it's a lovely bit of writing, you just have to lose it. So for example, in Tarnished there was a wonderful scene, I loved it so much, where we learned more about Loz and Peg, because we went back to Loz's parents' house for a rather bohemian North London sort of dinner, and it was a whole chapter, and it was very funny, and it showed all the class differences and the way that kind of Peg was seen as a kind of these liberal North London parents kind of loved having a lesbian daughter and loved having a lesbian daughter whose partner was a black woman and all of that kind of thing, and I just thought, this can almost be a lovely short story on its own, but it's just kind of flesh, and there was too much flesh at that point, so something had to go on a bit of a diet, the story. So I took that out and I just refer to it now. I mean, that's all it needed was a reference to it. So yes, I think you have to be really brutal in that way, and almost every novel I write, there's at least one chapter that goes wholesale, just goes. But then right down to the sentence level, if a sentence doesn't advance things narratively, off it goes. It just goes. So any detail, because a novel is a story told through details, and every detail has to work towards that story. So don't go on about the leaves on the trees unless they do something to the characters, do something to the mood, kind of do something to the reader. You can't just have pretty set dressing.
Yeah, and actually another thing that I've seen in your advice and guide articles and podcasts that you said before is that you've made me think of with your nice vignette there at the North London dinner is conflict. And it's interesting, since reading that sort of a month or two ago, I'm now reading through the eyes of every chapter, scenes within that. What is the conflict? And sometimes it's light conflict, but I can see in the good writing that I'm reading, yeah, there is conflict in every kind of. There's always some friction going on, and so that's another key element of particularly continuing to grip people throughout. Was that one of the reasons that scene had to go? Was there conflict within it?
Well, there was conflict in that kind of Peg felt incredibly uncomfortable. She doesn't like going there at all because she kind of feels a bit like a kind of, I don't know, a trophy wife kind of thing for Loz there. But yes, I think that's why I think so many writers and so many readers are drawn to crime fiction, because conflict is if you get it right down to the nub, conflict is at the very essence of crime fiction. It's obviously characters in conflict with the law, characters in conflict with the kind of moral norms, the normal expectations, characters in conflict with the world outside and with themselves, doing things that they don't necessarily think is right, or that they don't want to do, or that kind of get in the way of their aims. And in terms of kind of like the overall conflict of a plot, another kind of basic plot kind of dynamic is that your protagonist wants something. And this is something, again, my first agent who taught me a lot, Simon Trewin, he's a wonderful agent. He said, what does your character want? You've got to know that at the beginning. And then, so that is what drives the story through to the end. And the plot is the curveballs you throw at them to stop them getting what they want.
I think it's another one of those great maxims I heard again in podcasts and what have you that writers say around this, and it might even be a Stephen King quote, of which there are, of course, so many to quote, but it says, a novel is the statement of what the protagonist wants, and then 800 pages of them not getting it, or words to that effect. And I think from my own sort of hobby experience is that was certainly one of the reasons that my first hobby novel didn't work, is that the protagonist wasn't a protagonist. They were just a complete spectator to the stuff going on around them, didn't really have a horse in the race until sort of the middle. And so really it's just like watching a TV show in a foreign language that you don't care about already. So it's conflict, promises, etc., to know that those things need to be in there.
Absolutely. And this is what I mean about craft. If you know these things, then actually creating a story that grips, it's far easier. I mean, it's never easy, but it's a lot easier if you know the tricks, you know the kind of the tropes. And that's not to say that one should write to a pattern, but these are just kind of like, if you like, the kind of the scaffold around which your unique story can be told, that the washing line that you can hang your story pegs on, to use a more domestic metaphor.
Can I ask as well, so have there been, and probably in your earlier writing, where we're starting to see the nuts and bolts, starting to be able to see the whole and know what's going on at various points? Because until you've written a lot, or you've been good at plotting and structuring, whether it's in your mind or using Excel spreadsheets, it's just a load of words until you go, right, well, I know I'm blocking, so this is the gripping bit, here's the reveal, and here's the resolution. Until you get there, it's just a giant long train of words. So I wonder, were there any experiences that you had sort of early on where you were learning how to grip? Because again, it was so deft in Tarnished as I read it. But I wonder, was there a time when you were sort of starting out when you were like, oh, I'm going to move this, or I need to amplify this, or?
Well, no, not really. I think as time's gone on, I've applied those theories more because, well, I'll talk about the because later. But I think that basically, most of us through our reading, most of us who are writers are readers as well. And we're also we're probably consumers of kind of film, which is kind of always an exercise in structure, and television series, particularly now these long form kind of like 12-part Better Called Sauls and stuff like that. They're masterpieces of structure. And for a lot of us, because of all that consumption, it's fairly innate. And I think that there is kind of the reason that, we've got 3-act structures and when you plant things, you should plant them in threes or on uneven numbers, because there is something pleasing, satisfying and kind of like visceral, natural in us that finds that a good thing. Particularly in Western culture, I don't know about world cultures, other world cultures, but certainly for us in the West, that is something that is innate in our understanding of story. So for me, the first few books were fairly just, I sat down and wrote them. I did a real Stephen King, which is, he starts with a situation and then he just writes, pantsing, but to use the NaNoWriMo term. And I absolutely did that. And then, of course, there's a lot of organisation that goes on after the act. But I never really kind of consciously applied a 3-act structure until probably after Tarnished, in fact. More like Her Husband's Lover, perhaps. And then the last few, I've been very conscious, kind of, I've got a... Well, I have had. I've got rid of that now because I tend to use Scrivener, the virtual corkboard. But I arrange the scenes as I'm developing the scenes. And I plot now. I have index cards, virtual index cards, and I have them arranged in 3 acts. And I use Alex. Oh look, I've got it right here. In fact, I've got Alexandra Sokolov's book, Stealing Hollywood: Story Structure Secrets for Writing Your Best Book. And Alex is a crime writer, but she's also been a Hollywood screenwriter, and so she knows all about structure. And it's a really thick book. And it's got lots and lots of kind of deconstruction of film structure, but also some very, very useful outlines of what should happen where and when. And I find that incredibly reassuring and helpful, particularly when you're writing. Oh God, the last year I wrote 2 novels from scratch in 12 months, and that was because that's what my publisher wanted me to do, and I thought it was a challenge. I don't know how many years I could carry on doing that. Not very long, I fear. But in order to do that successfully, I needed to know what I was writing. I didn't have time to go back and kind of really tidy up a very messy story. I could tidy up some very messy words, but I needed my story structure, the what happens. So story is what happens, and plot is what happens and why. So as I develop the story, the why comes as well in the plot, and then I arrange it all. And I know that now. So I do what I used to think was incredibly boring. I have a whole load of empty virtual index cards on my Scrivener, which I know what's got to happen in each chapter or each scene, and that's how I start writing. And I know my characters and I know my world. I have found those 2 novels I wrote in 6 months each. I found them been the most pleasurable writing I've ever done, and partly that was because I had this roadmap, but also partly because I was working with a brilliant editor, Ruth Tross at Cuckoo, who's literally one of the best in the game. She's fantastic. So she signed off my story before I started writing, so I knew it was solid. If Ruth thinks it works, man, it works. So I felt like I already had my belt and braces on before I put my trousers up. You see what I mean?
Right. Yes. And I mean, there's so much in there, particularly with structure and plotting and Scrivener. I know people use various things that are similar to that to help sort of structure. Again, I cannot imagine writing anything cohesive by the seat of my pants. I have to plot, have to see everything, have to be able to navigate, know what the end is to navigate through it. But my understanding is that crime can be important to plot, because you at least would need to know who the killer is or the reason or anything, or can you literally just unfold? It would seem almost impossible, really.
Yeah, I mean, with Tarnished, I didn't really... I did a complete about turn. The person I thought was going to be the baddie isn't. And I only came to that realisation about halfway in.
Okay.
So I surprised myself.
Does that mean, though, that there are things that you've set up to be X, but then you've changed it to Y, and so some things need unpicking?
Oh, yes.
Or is it...
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, you can't... I mean, yes, because going that way, there's a wonderful E.L. Doctorow quote that I use quite a lot, is that... obviously, I don't believe this now, but it's something that is what I used to do. Writing a novel is like driving a car at night. You know where you come from, you know where your destination is, but you can only see as far as the car headlights light up on the way. And that's a wonderful metaphor for writing like that. And the other one I use is my own, which is so the first draft for me. So a creative act is the world of choice. You've got the entire universe of choice, and the creative act is a series of decisions you make. So if you think of the world of choice as a forest, and you've got to get to the other side of the forest, for me, the first draft is putting my hands over my ears, shutting my eyes, and just running as fast as I can, and trying to find my way through. And then the second draft is me going back and then picking over every twig and branch and finding out whether that was the right decision. So that was how I used to write, and it's great fun. It's invigorating, and it's certainly enjoyable so long as you don't have a deadline, because you can then end up with a pile of just incoherent nonsense that then you have to spend years and years writing. There's a wonderful book, rewriting. There's a wonderful book, Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, which is along with Stephen King's On Writing, is my Bible, and she talks about the shitty first draft, and then she talks about a novel that wouldn't go away and never got published, and sitting down there and taking it apart and putting it back together and taking it apart and putting it back together. And I have had those experiences, and you can go through such extremes of despair when you've got something that you know doesn't work, your agent or your editor has told you that it doesn't work, and you have to make it work. And it can be so awful, and sometimes you just want to sit down, just tear it all up and start all over again with a completely new premise, because of course the novel that you haven't written is perfect, whereas the novel you have written is always flawed, always. Even if you're happy with it, it's still very different and flawed to the original vision that you had when you started. But yes, I think that the other thing I said, there's 3 things you need to become a successful novel. I would probably add the other one, the fourth, is bloody-mindedness and determination to make it work, and almost like a stubbornness with yourself, that you will get moments where things all look awful and hopeless and they won't work, and for some people that starts, it's the beginning of their career. For me, it kind of hit me sort of in the middle of, after about 4 or 5 books, and I felt like a bit lost as a writer. But I managed to get my mojo back. But that was through kind of just pegging at it and keeping writing, sometimes writing the wrong thing, but carrying on and making sure that I got through it. And I don't know why. I could have given up and got a much better paid job doing something else. But it's just, I can't really think of anything else I'd rather be doing, really, than making shit up. What a great way to make a kind of living.
Well, I wanted just to talk about a few specifics of the sort of the craft, and particularly that sort of gripping readers in that sort of the early portions of the book. I mean, a handful of examples that I could kind of think of, and again, cinema is a great place to draw these ideas from. I think increasingly it seems that we're set up often with a prologue, with the protagonist doing something, action, heroic, solving a crime, etc., that then we pivot to the sort of the start of the rest of the story. But things on that list might include cliffhangers, mysteries, surprises and twists, like sub and parallel plots, and of course conflict. Are there other kinds of device and things that you may consciously or unconsciously have in mind that that you can deploy to make promises and to grip your audience, to those readers?
Yeah, the way you frame that makes it sound like there's a kind of toolbox that you can have, and I think that kind of oh God, I wish.
Of course. I mean,
each story has its own requirements. The thing is with domestic noir is that we're supposed to always kind of put twists in, and a twist is a structural thing. It's not a kind of about face. It has to be something that's so embedded structurally that when it happens, the reader who hasn't seen it coming will go, oh yeah, of course. So that's what you've got to do. And, sometimes, when the editor says, this is working really, really well, but what we need is one final twist. Yeah. And every writer goes, oh, no. And I think that some of us wish that we could just get away with no twist, but readers really expect it. I, as a reader, really expect a twist now. Even if I'm reading literary fiction, I'm going, where's the twist? What's going to happen? But then, I read with a crime writer's mind. I always expect terrible things to happen. I've just read my friend Josie Lloyd's amazing, wonderful, heartwarming book called Life Saving for Beginners. And it's just totally wonderful, positive book about sea swimming. And I read it and I was thinking, when are they going to drown? When's the shark going to come? And yeah, so it's about injecting tension, isn't it? It's that's what I do as a crime writer. That's what I like to do. So ways of injecting tension are throwing a metaphorical bomb into the proceedings. So, and that could be a revelation. It could be someone turning up. It could be spotting someone across the road. It could be a literal bomb. It could be an animal charging at them. It could be anything that kind of then shakes things up. So if things are getting slow, bring in a plot element that has to be advanced, a story element that has to be advanced, and just plonk it there right in the middle somehow. And that can be really, really helpful. But the twists, sometimes you've already planned them as a writer, and obviously now I do plan them, but sometimes twists can kind of come to you as you're writing, and sometimes they can come to you after you've written, so you kind of reverse engineer them. So that's the other thing I think is reverse engineering is really, really useful, and don't think that you have to write from A to B, A to Z. You can if you have written to A to Z and you decide that something needs to be in at X, you can then go back and plant it in B. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. You can go and hang that rifle on the wall if you need it. And I think I've probably Stephen King, but certainly I've heard it said that it's better to let the twists or the mysteries come towards the end, because if you need to write them without knowing they're there, because the reader will also read them in that way. Whereas if you're constantly nudge, nudge, wink, wink, rifle on the wall, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, rifle on the wall, throughout your book, the twist will not be one. It will not be a surprise. You'll have loaded it all along the way.
Yeah. Or the converse of that argument is that if you know that you've got to make character X out to be, if you know that he's going to turn out to be the serial killer, throughout the whole novel, you make him into a pussycat, and you work really hard to make him into a pussycat, so that you don't see it coming. So that you know what you're working against. I think that comes with experience. That you learn how to mislead people.
Yes, and I wonder as well, just as we sort of get towards the end, is any great examples or any particular favourites of yours, brilliantly gripping opening chapters or the starts of novels, but also any that you've seen through teaching, and we obviously won't name names, but of where things were not gripping, but that subsequently after feedback the person did tackle that, and what they did to tackle that.
I've just recently reread Rebecca, and the framing device in that is so brilliant. That opening line. I'm not going to misquote it, but the one about Mandalay. I was going to say it's so memorable. But that the story has already happened, and everything has unravelled, and we're looking at it from then, and then we go back. It's just the way that time is manipulated there. It's so wonderful. So the thing with beginning writers is that there is a desire to set out the whole world before you start telling the story. And somebody sent me a first draft of their novel, and I said, you know what you could do? You could cut the first 3 chapters. And he did that, and it was so much better. So much better. Start in medias res, start in the middle of the action. And you only need the reader to know enough to understand what's going on right then. You don't need to know the whole history and everything. If that is important for the story, you can drop that in later. But if you're going to start with the kind of the inciting incident, the action. So, for example, with Cuckoo, although it starts in a kind of very kind of Arga Saga way before it turns into a nasty Arga Saga, the first thing that happens is the phone call from Polly, the old friend, saying that her husband's died in Greece and she needs somewhere to stay. So, that is the action moment there. It's not high tension, not high drama, but it is a big change in a life. It's kind of the only setup I needed there was just the beautiful. Rose and Gareth, Rose, the main protagonist, and her husband Gareth have just settled down to a glass of wine in their meticulously and painstakingly restored house just outside Bath. And they're sitting there and the sun's playing on the flagstones or something, and the phone rings. We can't do Return of the Native anymore. It's, 4 chapters of a character walking across a landscape or whatever. I'm sure I exaggerate, but I remember going, oh my God, is he still walking across that hill when I read it?
Yeah. It's interesting, a couple of podcasts ago was talking about On the Road, which when I was 19, again, I think the setting that I would get to through Kerouac's eyes, drive across America in the 40s and 50s. But actually, I reread it a couple of years ago, and it's almost unreadable because other than that setting, it seems like a straight line.
Do you think that's because you've changed as a reader?
Absolutely.
Or do you think it's that culturally what we've come to expect is more narrative because of the way we consume narrative now?
Yeah.
I guess the latter informs the former, right? Is that, as I become a more, if not mature, certainly older reader and have read more widely, because, again, reading it at 19, I think I'd read like The Very Hungry Caterpillar and then the Miles Davis autobiography and not much beyond that. So On the Road was sort of fresh and exciting at that moment. So, and maybe as we study writing and read more, you are reading as a writer. And I think actually it was Miles Davis who said, when you're classically trained, you don't hear a song, you hear chord progressions and notes picked out. And so as we read, we're reading, that's the prologue, that's the hook, that's the promise. So maybe reading On the Road at age 40 was just a bit, I was sort of, where's the reversal? Where's the climax? Where's the character development? Yes, interesting. Interesting that you said that actually it's cutting of the chapters at the beginning rather than putting things in.
Yeah. I mean, for some writers it's different. I've got a great friend, Colette Macbeth, who's a wonderful writer, and she always writes short, perhaps 40 to 50,000 words, and then has to build the writing for the second draft. I always write long. I mean, my first drafts have never come in at fewer than 120,000 words. And with my latest, The Daughters, that was 120,000 words. It's barely 80 now. I skimmed it so much. I really, really enjoyed that though. It's so wonderful. It's just great kind of going, that's unnecessary. And it's sort of, so you do that by cutting out chunks, first of all, and then you go through it again and you cut out kind of sentences, and then you go through it again and you cut out words. So, like, if anyone wants a quick fix to getting their word count down, word search that, because we overuse that so much. You can often lose a that in a sentence. And also, I applied, it sounds really arbitrary. Setting yourself rules can be very useful and can be very helpful in a creative act. And I learnt that on my MA as well, that, that rules and kind of, guidelines for yourself can just be a useful part of your toolbox. No chapter longer than 2,000 words. So I kept on, if one came in at 2,100 words, I keep on skimming away little razor blade slices of words here and there until I got down to 2,000. And that was such fun. And it makes the prose tighter and tighter. And I'm going to do that for every single novel now. No chapter longer than 2,000 words. But also kind of 2,000 words is... I read in the bath. If a chapter's longer than 2,000 words, I go pruny.
Right.
Brilliant. Julia, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. There's just what a wealth of fantastic advice and insights in there that certainly from my own sort of hobby writing, I can sort of feel the tightening, getting it gripping straight from the off. So thank you so much for talking to us.
Thanks, Gil.
A big thank you to Julia for her time.
If you have questions or want to get in touch, you can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Writers Centre, and you'll find us on Facebook by searching National Centre for Writing. Don't forget to sign up to our weekly newsletter by visiting nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk and clicking the orange drop-down box on the homepage.
As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation over on the website today by hitting the Support Us button in the top nav.
Don't forget to subscribe, rate and review us because it helps other writers to find the podcast.
Thanks again, keep writing, and we'll catch you on the next episode.